Hey guys, tonight we are going to work our way through the most scandalous stories ever told about the queens and empresses of the medieval world. Stories of secret lovers and midnight passages, of towers and trials and poisoned cups, of women accused of every sin the medieval imagination could produce. And the medieval imagination, I promise you, could produce a great deal. And I want to be honest with you about where these stories come from because it changes how you hear them. Almost none of it comes from the women themselves. The queens did not write memoirs. They did not leave us their side. What we have instead are the chroniclers, monks mostly, courtiers, enemies, men with quills and grudges and a great deal of time, sitting in scriptoriums and writing down what they had heard, or what they suspected, or what they very much hoped was true. So when I tell you tonight that a queen did something outrageous, what I am really telling you is that a man with a pen said she did. Sometimes he was there, sometimes he was 300 miles away and working from rumour. Sometimes he loathed her and her family and everything she stood for, and it shows. So, before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always 2 in the morning somewhere. Also, thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. And if this channel helps you drift off, tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim those lights. Switch on a fan for some sweet background hum and get comfortable, because we are going back through the centuries, back through the long quiet dark, to a city on the water, and a woman who started with nothing, and the man who never forgave her for it. We begin, as so much of this begins, with a historian who hated somebody. His name was Procopius, and he lived in Constantinople in the 6th century, and by day he was the most respectable writer in the empire. He was the official historian. He wrote the great sober accounts of the wars, careful and measured, the sort of thing that gets you a comfortable position and a nod from the emperor. If you have ever heard someone quote a Byzantine source on the reign of Justinian, the odds are excellent that they were quoting Procopius, and that they were quoting him respectfully, because his public work is genuinely first-rate. And then he died, and at some point afterward, somebody found the other book. It is called The Secret History, and it is one of the strangest documents ever produced by a human being. It was not published in his lifetime, and it plainly could not have been, because publishing it would have got him killed within the hour. It sat unread for centuries, and it surfaced eventually in the Vatican Library, and when scholars finally read it, they could hardly believe what they were holding, because The Secret History is the same careful historian writing about the same emperor and the same court, and he has taken the lid off. In his public books, Justinian is the great lawgiver. In The Secret History, Justinian is a demon. Not a metaphorical demon. Procopius means it fairly literally. He reports, deadpan, that servants claim to have seen the emperor's head simply leave his body and wander about the palace at night before returning. He reports that Justinian's face sometimes dissolved into a shapeless lump of flesh. He suggests the man was a devil in human shape, sent to destroy the world, and he is not being playful about it. And then he gets to the Empress, and things become considerably worse. Because the real target of The Secret History, the thing that gives it its heat and its extraordinary energy, is Theodora, the emperor's wife. And Procopius does not merely dislike her, he is consumed. He goes at her with an inventiveness and a stamina that is genuinely astonishing to read, and he keeps it up for chapter after chapter, and you can feel him enjoying himself, and you can feel him hating himself for enjoying it, and it is one of the most peculiar reading experiences in all of ancient literature. So that is our first storyteller, and I want you to hold him in mind, because he sets the pattern for everything that follows. A clever, well-placed, well-informed man, with genuine access and genuine talent, writing in secret, at length, with total freedom, about a woman he despised. Whatever else the secret history is, it is proof of something that will be true of every story we tell tonight. The most detailed account of a queen's private life is very often written by the person who wanted her destroyed. Let that man and his secret book settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the woman he could not stop writing about, and to where she came from, which was nowhere at all. Theodora's father looked after the bears. That is where this starts. Her father was a bear keeper at the Hippodrome in Constantinople, which was the great racing stadium at the heart of the city, the place where the whole population went to scream at chariots and take sides. The Hippodrome had factions, the blues and the greens, and they were not merely sports teams, they were political blocs and street gangs and social clubs all in one, and to belong to one was to have an identity. Her father worked for one of them, minding the animals that were part of the spectacle, and it was about as low a position as a working man could hold while still being somebody. And then he died, and Theodora was very small, and her mother had 3 little girls and no income at all, and no husband, and no prospects, in a city that had no mercy for such a family. There is a story, and it is a good one, that the mother dressed the 3 girls in garlands and pushed them out into the arena in front of the whole crowd, to beg for the dead man's position to be given to their new stepfather, and that one faction jeered and the other took pity. Whether it happened exactly like that we cannot say, but something like it happened, and Theodora learned before she was 10 what it feels like to stand in front of thousands of people and beg, and to be laughed at by some of them. She went into the theatre because that is what girls in her position did. And I need to explain what the theatre meant, because it did not mean what it means to us. An actress in the late Roman world was not a respected artist. The word was very close to a slur. The profession was legally and socially disreputable to a degree that is hard to convey. So much so that Roman law barred men of high rank from marrying actresses at all, as a matter of statute. They were considered a separate and lesser kind of person. So Theodora grew up poor, fatherless, mocked, and in a profession that the respectable classes regarded as barely human. And then she married the Emperor of the Roman Empire. Justinian saw her and wanted her, and there was a law in his way, and so he simply had the law changed. His uncle was on the throne, and the statute forbidding a senator from marrying an actress was repealed, and Justinian married her, and when he came to the throne she was crowned beside him. The bear-keeper's daughter became the most powerful woman in the world, and she was not a decorative empress either. She sat in the councils, she held opinions and pressed them. She has a claim to being one of the most formidable political operators of the entire century. Now, hold that story in your mind, because it explains absolutely everything about the secret history. Procopius was a gentleman. He came from the respectable world, the world of position and education and inherited standing, and he had to bow to a woman from the Hippodrome. Every day of his career he had to enter a room and lower his head to the bear-keeper's daughter and call her Majesty and mean it. He never got over it, and when he finally sat down in private to write what he really thought, that is where he went first and hardest. Let that girl from the Hippodrome and the throne she climbed to settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what Procopius wrote about her, which is where our whole scandalous evening truly begins. I am going to handle this the way one handles a hot dish, which is with a cloth and at arm's length. The secret history accuses Theodora, at enormous length, of a career of almost incredible indecency before she came to the throne. Procopius says she was notorious throughout the city. He says she performed on stage in ways that scandalized even an audience that was extremely difficult to scandalize. He describes a particular routine involving trained geese that has been the delight and embarrassment of classicists for 400 years, and which I am absolutely not going to describe to you at bedtime, and which you are perfectly free to look up in the morning if you must. He claims she was insatiable. He claims she boasted about it. He claims she complained, in public, about the limitations of the human body, which is a line so outrageous that scholars have spent centuries arguing about whether he could possibly have heard it, or whether he simply thought of it in the bath and could not bear to leave it out. He goes into detail that is genuinely pornographic, and this is why, for hundreds of years, English editions of The Secret History would run along perfectly happily in English, and then, at certain paragraphs, silently drop into Latin. The translators simply could not bring themselves to do it. If you find an old edition on a library shelf, you can still see it happening. The English stops. The Latin starts. The Latin goes on for a while. The English resumes, looking innocent. And then, having established all that, he turns to her time as Empress and accuses her of everything else: cruelty, vindictiveness, ruining her enemies for sport, making people disappear, manipulating Justinian entirely, running the empire from behind him, being the true source of every calamity of the age. He blames her for essentially all of it. Now, here is what I find genuinely fascinating about this, and it is not the geese. It is the shape of the attack. Look at what he chose. He was a talented, well-informed man with real access to the court, and he clearly had genuine grievances about how the empire was run. And if he had wanted to write a devastating account of Theodora's political failures, he was extremely well placed to do it. And instead, when he sat down in secret with total freedom to say anything he liked, he reached, immediately and overwhelmingly, for her body. That is the oldest weapon in the box. It is not an argument. It does not require evidence. It cannot really be refuted, because how would she refute it? And it works. It has always worked. On a powerful woman in a way it simply does not on a powerful man. Justinian gets accused of being a literal demon whose head detaches, which is such an extraordinary claim that it slides off him and is remembered as a curiosity. Theodora gets accused of promiscuity, and 1500 years later, it is still the first thing most people know about her. He was a very clever man, Procopius. He knew exactly which of those two accusations would stick. Let that secret manuscript, and everything in it, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the day the bearkeeper's daughter saved the empire, which Procopius also wrote down, and which rather complicates the picture. Here is the thing that makes Theodora so interesting, and it comes from the same pen. In the year 532, the city exploded. It began, as these things do, at the races with the two great factions of the hippodrome, and it turned into a riot, and the riot turned into a full uprising against the emperor. They called it the Nika Revolt, after the word the crowd was chanting, which meant conquer. Half of Constantinople went up in flames. The mob proclaimed a rival emperor, and Justinian in the palace, with the fires reflecting in the windows and the roar coming up from the streets, decided to run. The ships were ready at the harbour steps. The treasure was loaded. The plan was to flee across the water, save their lives, and give up the throne. And the council agreed. This was, in fairness, an entirely sensible plan, because emperors who stayed in these situations tended to be torn apart. And then Theodora spoke. The speech is recorded by Procopius himself, in his public history, which is its own delicious irony. She said, in effect, that whether or not it was right to flee, she would not do it. She said that she agreed with the old saying that the imperial purple makes a fine burial shroud. She said that if he wished to save himself, he could. There were the ships, there was the sea, there was the money, but as for her, she was staying, and the room turned. The emperor stayed, the generals rallied, and the revolt was crushed, and Justinian sat on that throne for another 33 years, and rebuilt the burned city, and put up Hagia Sophia in the ashes, and it is still standing tonight, and it would not be there if the bearkeeper's daughter had not been the bravest person in that room. Now hold both things in your hand at once, because this is the whole puzzle of the medieval queen in a single life. Procopius, the same man, wrote both. He wrote the secret history, in which she is a monster of depravity who destroyed the world. And he wrote the public history, in which she stands up in a burning city when every man present has already given up, and says the purple is a good shroud and saves an empire. And there is a third thing, which is not a story at all, and which is in some ways the most damning of the lot, because it is not a matter of opinion, it is in the law books, because Theodora legislated, and when you look at what she pushed for, a pattern comes out of it so clear that it is almost embarrassing. She went after the trade in girls, the men who bought poor children from desperate parents in the provinces and brought them to the capital to be used. She had them prosecuted. She had laws passed against it. She is credited with establishing a house on the far side of the Bosphorus where women taken out of that trade could go and live, at imperial expense. She strengthened the position of women in divorce, and in property, and in the guardianship of their own children. She made it harder for a man to destroy a woman and walk away. Nobody made her do any of that. It won her nothing politically. The people it helped had no money, no votes, and no voice, and were precisely the people she had grown up among, in the theatre, in the world Procopius sneered at her for coming from. She got to the very top, and then she reached back down. You cannot have all three, or rather, you can, but only if you accept something slightly uncomfortable, which is that the man was not describing a woman at all. He was describing his feelings about a woman, and his feelings were complicated, and one of them was rage, and another, whether he ever admitted it to himself, was probably something quite close to awe. Let that burning city, and the woman who would not run, settle gently in the dark. We turn now away from Constantinople and westward into the forests of Gaul, where two queens are about to spend 40 years trying to destroy each other, and where the chroniclers had an even better time. The Merovingians were the ruling family of the Franks, and if you have never heard of them, you are in for a treat, because they were completely out of control. They ruled what is now France, and a good deal of Germany, in the centuries after Rome came apart, and their family history reads like a soap opera written by somebody who has been told that soap operas need more murder. The kingdom was divided and redivided among brothers who loathed each other. Everybody married everybody's widow, and in the middle of the 6th century, into this arrangement walked two women who would fight a private war for 40 years and take the whole kingdom down with them. The first was Fredegund. She began, according to the chroniclers, as a servant, some say a slave. She was in the household of King Chilperic, and she was, by every account, beautiful and quick, and absolutely without fear, and she caught the king's eye, and became his mistress. The problem was that Chilperic then decided to marry properly. His brother had made a splendid match with a Visigothic princess from Spain, and Chilperic wanted one too, so he sent for the princess's sister. Her name was Galswintha, and she came north with a great dowry, and she married the king, and she found Fredegund still very much in the house. And then Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. Chilperic mourned for a few days, which the chroniclers note with a certain dryness, and then married Fredegund. The servant girl became queen, and in Spain, and then in the neighbouring Frankish kingdom, the murdered woman's sister heard the news. Her name was Brunhilda. She was the queen of the neighbouring kingdom, married to Chilperic's brother, and she was a princess of the Visigoths, educated, formidable, and entirely convinced that her sister had been murdered by the woman who was now sitting on the throne next to her sister's husband. She was almost certainly right, and so it began. Two queens in two adjoining kingdoms, one a princess and one a servant, one avenging a murdered sister and one defending a stolen crown, and neither of them prepared to die first. It would run for 4 decades. It would kill kings, princes, bishops, and armies. It would end with one of them destroying the other, in a way so infamous that people still wince at it 14 centuries later. And every step of it was written down by a bishop named Gregory of Tours, who knew both women personally, who was frightened of one and possibly rather fond of the other, and who could not have been more delighted with his material. Let those two queens, and the 40-year war they are about to start, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to Fredegund, and to the astonishing list of things the chroniclers say she did. Gregory of Tours was a bishop, and he wrote the history of the Franks, and he had met Fredegund, and you can feel his hand shaking slightly on the page. The list of things he lays at her door is remarkable. She is supposed to have arranged the killing of her rival in the bed we have already visited. She is supposed to have arranged the murder of her husband's son by an earlier marriage, and then of another son, and then of a bishop who annoyed her. She is credited with sending 2 assassins to kill Brunhilde's husband, King Sigebert, at the very moment he was being raised on a shield and proclaimed victorious, which, if true, is one of the most theatrically timed assassinations in European history. The killers stabbed him with poisoned blades. He died on the shield. The war was on. The stories keep coming. There is a bishop she disliked, murdered at the altar. There are clerics sent to Brunhilde's court with concealed knives and instructions. There is the tale of the daughter, in which Fredegund and her own child are quarrelling over a chest of jewellery, and Fredegund invites the girl to lean in and look at the treasure, and then drops the lid of the chest on her neck and leans on it, and only the screaming of the servant stops her. There is the story of the whipping she gave that same daughter. There is the scene, and I do not know whether to believe a word of it, but I love it, in which she is at a christening and hears something she does not like, and simply has the man responsible arrested and executed before the service is finished. And there is her death, which is the most extraordinary detail of all. She died in bed, peacefully, of natural causes, in her own home, an old woman, undefeated, having outlived nearly everyone who ever tried to stop her, and having secured the throne for her son. She won. That is the part the chroniclers could not forgive. Gregory clearly expected, in the deep structure of his beliefs, that a woman like this would come to a spectacular and instructive end, and instead she died comfortably in her bed at a decent age, and was buried with full honours, and her son ruled after her, and her line went on. Whatever the moral arithmetic of the 6th century was supposed to be, Fredegund broke it. Now, is any of this true? Some of it, certainly. She was undoubtedly ruthless, and undoubtedly powerful, and the assassination of Sigebert is about as well attested as anything in the period. But you can also feel the pen accelerating. The stories get better as they go, the way stories do at a good dinner party. And underneath it all is that fact the chroniclers could never quite say out loud, which is that Fredegund had begun as a servant and ended as the mother of a king, and that the entire aristocratic order of the Frankish world found that unbearable and needed her to be a monster, because the alternative was to admit that a servant girl had simply been cleverer than all of them. Let that queen and her long list settle gently in the dark. We turn now to her enemy, the princess, and to what 40 years of hatred finally cost her. Brunhilde outlived them all. That was her problem. She was, by every measure, the more impressive ruler. She had been raised a princess, educated properly, and she governed her kingdom with genuine skill for decades. She corresponded with the Pope. She built and repaired roads, some of them Roman roads that still carry her name in local memory. She was a serious political figure, and even the chroniclers who despised her had to concede that she was formidable. And she never let go of her sister. That is the thread that runs through the whole 40 years. Galswintha, strangled in a bed in the year 568, is still driving events in the year 600, because Brunhilde would not put it down, and Fredegund would not apologize, and neither of them would die. Fredegund won by dying first, comfortably, in her bed. Brunhilde kept going, into her 60s and beyond, ruling through her son, and then through her grandsons, and then through her great-grandsons, which is where she made her error. Because a queen who rules through one child is a regent, and a queen who is still ruling through a fourth generation is, to the nobles around her, simply an obstacle that will not move. They turned on her. The Frankish aristocracy, who had been chafing under her for decades, went over to Fredegund's son, Clothar, and handed her to him. She was, by then, somewhere around 70 years old. And what he did to her is one of the most infamous executions in European history, and I am going to tell you that it happened and not tell you what it was. She was subjected to a public spectacle over several days, and then killed in a manner involving horses, and it was designed to be as humiliating and as memorable as possible, and it was carried out on a woman who had ruled for 40 years and was old enough to be the king's grandmother. That is all. That is as far as we go. The details are in the books if you want them, and they will not improve your sleep. What I want to leave you with is the why, because the why is the point. They did not kill her like that because of anything she had done. Kings did terrible things constantly in that century, and were generally killed cleanly if they were killed at all. They did it like that because she was an old woman who had held power too long, and because the spectacle was the message. The manner of her death was a statement, addressed to everybody watching, about what happens to a woman who does not step aside. And Clothar, Fredegund's son, sat on the throne of a reunited Frankish kingdom, and the 40-year war between the servant and the princess was finally over, and the servant had won it from beyond the grave. Let that long war and its end settle gently in the dark. We turn now forward a few centuries, and to a queen accused of the one thing that could ruin a dynasty. In the 9th century there was an empress called Judith of Bavaria, and her story shows you the machine working at its purest. She was the second wife of the Emperor Louis the Pious, who was the son of Charlemagne, and she was young and clever and beautiful, and she had a son. That last part is the whole story, because Louis already had grown sons from his first marriage, and those sons had already been promised the empire, and now here was a stepmother with a baby boy of her own, and a great deal of influence over their aging father, and the arithmetic of their inheritance had suddenly changed, so they accused her of adultery. The man named was Bernard of Septimania, a nobleman close to the emperor, and the accusation was that Judith and Bernard were lovers, and that Bernard was effectively running the empire through her, and, in the most poisonous version, that the little boy might not be the emperor's at all. Look at what that accusation does. It is not just a slur, it is a legal and political weapon of extraordinary precision. If the queen is unfaithful, the child's paternity is in doubt. If the child's paternity is in doubt, his claim collapses. If his claim collapses, the older sons get everything back. The accusation does not need to be proved. It only needs to be made loudly enough and often enough that the doubt becomes permanent. They forced her into a convent. They forced the emperor to do public penance. And Judith, to her enormous credit, fought back, and she fought back on their terms, and she won. She was brought before an assembly, and she offered to clear herself by oath, in the proper legal form, and no one came forward to contradict her, and she was restored. Twice, in fact, because they did it to her more than once, and twice she got up, and twice she went back to the palace. And her son, the one whose paternity they had tried to poison, grew up and became Charles the Bald, and got his kingdom, and that kingdom eventually became France. So she won that one too, from beyond the grave, in the way that mothers sometimes do. But the rumour never quite died. It never does. 1200 years later, if you look Judith up, the affair with Bernard will be in the second paragraph, presented with a cautious maybe, and the caution will not help, because the maybe is the whole point. The maybe is what they were manufacturing. They did not need her convicted. They needed her permanently, faintly, forever suspected, and in that, if in nothing else, they succeeded completely. Let that empress and her enemies settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the north, where the sagas were doing exactly the same work, and doing it with rather more imagination. The Norse had their own chroniclers, except that they were not monks with quills, they were poets and saga writers, and they were working in a tradition that valued a good story far above a true one. And they produced, out of this, one of the great villainesses of the medieval North. Her name was Gunhild, and she was the wife of Eirik Bloodaxe, King of Norway, and if you take the sagas at their word, she was a figure of pure malevolence. They say she was not really Norwegian at all, but had been taken north as a girl and left with 2 Sami sorcerers to be taught magic, and that she learned everything they had to teach and then arranged their deaths and walked out. They call her Mother of Kings because she had a great many sons and pushed every one of them toward a throne. They say she used sorcery constantly, that she could raise storms at sea, that she could change her shape, that she sent spells against her enemies across great distances. They say she seduced men in order to ruin them, and that she cursed the poet Egil Skallagrimsson, one of the great heroes of the sagas, and hounded him for decades. And the interesting thing, the thing that makes her worth a few minutes tonight, is that the historians who look at her now are fairly confident that most of this is invention, and that some of it may not even be about a single person. The sagas were written down 2 and 3 centuries after she lived, by Icelanders whose ancestors had largely left Norway to get away from exactly the kings she was married to and mothered. She was, to the people writing about her, the wife of the enemy, the matriarch of the dynasty their own great-grandparents had fled. So she got the full treatment: foreign, sorceress, seductress, manipulator of weak kings, every accusation in the catalogue, and then the Norse speciality on top, which was actual magic, which is precisely what happened, in a different language and a different faith, to Bertrada and to Eleanor Cobham and to 100 other women. The details are wonderfully specific to the north, the storms and the shape-changing and the Sami sorcerers up in the snow. But the machine underneath is the machine we have been watching all night. A powerful woman, married into the ruling family, mother of kings, standing in the way of people who could not remove her. So she becomes a witch, and she becomes a seductress, and 300 years later somebody writes it down as history. The sagas are magnificent. They are some of the best storytelling in medieval Europe. But they are not a record, and Gunhild is not a woman. She is a role, and she has been playing it for 1,000 years. Let those storms and spells settle gently in the dark. We turn now to England, and to a queen who was made to walk across red-hot iron to prove a point. Emma of Normandy is one of the great survivors of the medieval world. She was married to 2 kings of England, one Anglo-Saxon and one Danish, and she was the mother of 2 more. And she sat near the centre of English power for something like 40 years, through a period of total chaos, and she came out the other side. And late in her life, according to a story that grew up afterwards, she was accused. The charge was that she had been improperly familiar with a bishop, and that her son, who was now king, believed it. And the story says that she demanded to clear her name in the way that the age provided, which was by ordeal. Now, I want to explain the ordeal because it is one of the strangest things the medieval mind ever produced, and it is genuinely fascinating. The theory was simple. God knows the truth. God will not permit an innocent person to be harmed. Therefore, you subject the accused to something that ought to injure them, and if they are unharmed, God has spoken. In practice, this meant carrying a red-hot iron bar a set distance, or plunging a hand into boiling water, and then having the wound bound up and inspected some days later to see whether it had festered or healed cleanly. And the version of the ordeal in Emma's story is the most theatrical of the lot. She was to walk barefoot across 9 red-hot ploughshares laid out on the floor of the cathedral at Winchester, in front of the whole court. The story says she prayed, and then she walked, and then she asked, "When will the ordeal begin?" And they told her that she had already crossed all 9 and had not felt a thing. Now, this almost certainly did not happen. It appears in accounts written considerably later, and it has the smooth, polished shape of a story that has been improved in the telling, and historians treat it as legend rather than record. But I love that it exists, and I love what it is for, because look at the shape of it. A queen is accused of unchastity. The accusation cannot be disproved by evidence, because that sort of accusation never can. So the story reaches past evidence entirely and goes straight to the highest court there is, and has God himself deliver the verdict, publicly, in front of everybody, by declining to burn her feet. That is a wish. That is somebody, somewhere, wishing very hard that there were a way for a slandered woman to be believed. And in the world these stories come from, there was not one, and so they had to invent one, and put God in it, and lay it out on the floor of a cathedral in 9 burning pieces of iron. Let those cold ploughshares settle gently in the dark. We turn now back east to Constantinople, and to an empress who was still causing scandal in her 70s. Zoe of Byzantium is a delight, and she is a rare case, because for once the scandalous stories were mostly true, and she did not care in the slightest. She was born into the imperial family, and she was kept, as imperial daughters often were, in the palace and out of the way, and she did not marry until she was around 50 years old. 50, half a century in the women's quarters, waiting while the empire happened elsewhere. And then her father died, and there was no male heir, and suddenly the entire legitimacy of the Byzantine throne ran through Zoe, and Zoe was very ready to live. She married 3 times, and she made every one of them emperor. The first was an elderly official who was hurried into the marriage and onto the throne, and who then, according to the chronicler Michael Psellos, spent his reign being extremely dull and was eventually found dead in his bath. There was a good deal of talk about that bath. The talk was largely about the fact that Zoe had, by then, taken up with a young man named Michael, and that Michael became emperor with remarkable speed after the bath, and that the whole thing had a certain tidiness to it that people found suggestive. The second husband, that same young Michael, turned out to be far less charming once crowned, and shut her away, and then died of illness. His nephew tried to remove her permanently and pack her off to a convent, and the city rose in fury on her behalf, because whatever the court thought of Zoe, the people of Constantinople regarded her as the rightful line, and they tore the usurper down. She was brought back in triumph, an old woman carried into the palace on the shoulders of a revolution. And then she married a 3rd time, in her 60s, to a man everybody knew had a long-standing mistress. And rather than making a scene about it, Zoe simply had the mistress installed at court and gave her a title, and the 3 of them proceeded to be a sort of imperial arrangement that scandalized the chroniclers and appeared to suit everyone involved perfectly well. Psellos, who knew her, is wonderfully catty about all this, and also cannot help liking her. He tells us she spent enormous sums on perfumes, that her private rooms were kept as hot as a furnace all year round for the manufacture of scents, that she gave money away recklessly, and that she looked remarkably good for her age, which he attributes, with a straight face, to the perfumes. Here is what I love about Zoe. She got out at 50 years of nothing, and then 20 years of doing precisely as she pleased at the head of the greatest empire in Christendom, marrying whom she liked, elevating whom she liked, being adored by a city that rioted to protect her, and dying in her 70s still on the throne. The chroniclers tutted. She simply did not care. It is the only story tonight where the woman gets to enjoy the scandal. Let that hot perfumed palace settle gently in the dark. We turn now to France, and to a queen who was stolen from one husband by another, and who then held on through an actual papal thunderbolt. Bertrada of Montfort was married to the Count of Anjou, and then the King of France saw her and decided he would rather like her instead. The king was Philip I, and he already had a wife, a Dutch princess named Bertha, whom he had put aside on the grounds that she had grown too fat, which is the actual stated reason and tells you a great deal about Philip. And Bertrada was married to Count Fulk of Anjou, who was by all accounts a difficult and violent man. And in the year 1092 the king and the countess simply left with each other. Whether she was carried off or went willingly is one of those questions the chroniclers could not agree on, and clearly relished not agreeing on. Some say abduction, some say elopement. Given the husband she was leaving, and the crown she was gaining, one can construct a fairly persuasive theory. And then they married, both of them already married, both spouses still alive, the King of France and the Countess of Anjou standing up in front of a bishop and being wed while their existing husband and wife were, as it were, still in the building. The church went off like a bomb. This was bigamy at the very top of Christendom, in public, unapologized for, and the papacy could not let it pass. Philip was excommunicated, not once, quietly, but repeatedly, over years. He was cut off from the sacraments. And in the most extraordinary escalation, an interdict was laid, which meant that wherever the king went, the church services stopped. Bells fell silent. The Mass was not said. He travelled through his own kingdom, and the churches closed as he approached, like shutters coming down, and opened again after he had passed. Imagine that. The king rides into a town, and the bells do not ring. Every person in that town knows why, and every person knows it is because of the woman riding beside him. That is not a punishment aimed at Philip. That is a punishment aimed at Bertrada, delivered in front of the entire kingdom, over and over, for years. And they stayed together anyway. That is the thing. Through all of it, the excommunications, the interdicts, the silent bells, the years of it, they simply refused to separate. Philip eventually made a formal gesture of submission because he had to, and then went straight back to her, and they were together until he died. She is supposed to have been at his side at the end, and after his death she went into a convent, of her own choosing, and lived quietly, and died there. The chroniclers, needless to say, decided she was a witch. That is the standard explanation whenever a medieval man makes a fool of himself over a woman, and they applied it here with enthusiasm. She had enchanted him. She had used potions. There was no other way to explain a king giving up the sacraments of his own religion. In an age when people believed in hell quite literally for a countess from Montfort, or of course, he simply preferred her. But that would not have made nearly as good a chronicle. Let those silent bells settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the Holy Land, to a queen who ruled Jerusalem, and to the rebellion that began with a rumour. Melisende was Queen of Jerusalem in her own right, and she is one of the most impressive rulers of the 12th century, and hardly anybody has heard of her. Her father was the king of Jerusalem, and had no sons, and so he did something unusual. He made her his heir, openly, and he arranged her marriage to a French count named Fulk of Anjou, on the explicit understanding that they would rule together, and he had them crowned together, and to make absolutely certain, on his deathbed he named Melisende and her infant son as co-rulers alongside her husband. He was building a fence around her, because he knew exactly what would happen otherwise. It did not work, of course. Fulk got the crown, and then set about pushing her out, filling the court with his own men from Anjou, and freezing her out of the government, which was precisely what her father had spent his last breath trying to prevent. And then, in 1134, someone accused her of adultery. The man named was Hugh, Count of Jaffa, who was her cousin, and who was also the most prominent nobleman opposing Fulk's takeover. And that is the whole thing in one sentence, really. The Queen's principal political ally was accused of being the Queen's lover, and the accusation came from the faction that wanted them both gone. It exploded into an actual civil war. Hugh was accused of treason, and he denied it and offered to fight a judicial duel to prove his innocence, which was the proper procedure, and then he did not turn up for it, which was catastrophic, because in that world failing to appear was as good as a confession. He was condemned. And then, while he was waiting to leave for exile, sitting in the street in Jerusalem playing dice, a knight walked up and stabbed him. And here is where it turns, and where Melisende shows you what she was made of. The city was convinced the king had ordered it, and Melisende, publicly and furiously, made it a crisis. The would-be assassin was tried and mutilated, and the king was forced to endure an investigation that came within an inch of him. And after that, Fulk was finished. The chronicler William of Tyre, who is our main source, says plainly that from that point on, the king did not attempt to take any action, even in trivial matters, without her knowledge. He had tried to push her out with an accusation of adultery, and she had turned it round and taken the government off him entirely, and she ruled Jerusalem for the next 20 years, through his death and through her own son's minority, and she was extremely good at it. And notice, one last time, the reflex. A queen has a political ally. The ally is inconvenient. Therefore, they are lovers. It did not even work here, and they reached for it anyway, because it was the first thing anybody ever reached for, and it very nearly cost them the kingdom. Let that queen and her city settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the most famous queen in Europe, and to the rumour that has followed her for 800 years. Eleanor of Aquitaine was the greatest heiress in Europe, and she was Queen of France, and then Queen of England, and she was the mother of 2 kings, and she lived to be about 80 in a century, when that was nearly miraculous, and she is probably the most famous woman of the entire Middle Ages. And the story that has stuck to her for 870 years is about a fortnight she spent in Antioch. She was married first to Louis VII of France, and it was not a happy match. He was pious and anxious and thoroughly overwhelmed by her, and she is supposed to have complained that she had married a monk rather than a king, which may be the single most quoted line she never certainly said. And in 1147 they went on crusade together, the 2 of them, all the way to the Holy Land, and on the way they stopped at Antioch. The Prince of Antioch was Raymond of Poitiers. He was Eleanor's uncle. He was also only a few years older than her, handsome by every account, charming, and from her own country, speaking her own language, in a way that her husband's dour northern court never had. And Eleanor spent a good deal of time with him, and they talked constantly, and they had strategy in common, because Raymond wanted the crusade to march on Aleppo, and Eleanor agreed with him, and Louis did not. And when Louis announced that they were leaving for Jerusalem instead, Eleanor said she would stay, and when he insisted, she is supposed to have said that their marriage was invalid anyway on grounds of consanguinity, which was a shattering thing to say out loud, and true, incidentally, in a technical sense that would eventually be used to dissolve the marriage. Louis had her taken from Antioch by force in the middle of the night. That is what happened. That is the whole of what we can actually establish. A queen sided with her uncle in a strategic argument, refused to leave, threatened her husband with an annulment, and was removed by force. And out of that, the chroniclers built the rumour that has never gone away, that she and Raymond were lovers, that it was incest. Some later writers went further and said she had taken up with Saladin, who was about 11 years old at the time and had not yet been born as a public figure, which gives you a fair sense of the standard of research involved. Now, notice the machine again, because it is exactly the same one. The Queen did something political. She backed a strategy. She defied her husband in council. She raised a legal argument about her own marriage. Every one of those is a political act by a political actor, and every one of them was translated, instantly, into a sexual accusation, because a woman making strategy is difficult to argue with, and a woman committing incest with her uncle is not. They got the annulment 2 years later, on those very grounds of consanguinity that she had raised herself. 8 weeks after it, Eleanor married Henry of Anjou, who became Henry II of England, and she brought Aquitaine with her, and in doing so, she handed England a third of France and set up 300 years of war. Louis had let go of the most valuable woman in Europe because he could not bear her, and it cost his kingdom more than any battle ever did. Let that fortnight in Antioch settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what Eleanor did next, which was to raise a rebellion against her second husband, and to what it cost her. Eleanor's second marriage was a good deal more successful than her first, at least at the beginning. Henry II was her match in energy and ambition, and they had 8 children, and between them they ran an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. And then, in 1173, she helped her sons raise an army against him. This is the part of Eleanor's life that I find far more interesting than Antioch, and it is the part that fewer people know. Her sons were grown and restless and given titles without power, and they rebelled, and Eleanor backed them. She was not a bystander, she was in it. She was moving between courts and raising support and doing the work. Against her own husband, the King of England, she was caught trying to reach Paris. The story says she was taken while riding in men's clothing, which may or may not be true and is far too good to leave out. And Henry did not execute her, because you did not execute the Duchess of Aquitaine, whose lands were the entire point of the marriage. So he did the other thing. He imprisoned her. For 16 years. 16 years. She was around 50 when it started, and about 66 when it ended. She was moved between castles in England, kept in comfort but kept, allowed out occasionally at Christmas when it suited him, and otherwise simply held, year after year, while her sons grew up, and her husband ruled, and the world went on without her. And here is what is remarkable, and here is why I wanted to tell you this, instead of the story about Antioch. When Henry finally died, in 1189, the very first act of the new king, her son Richard, was to send a messenger to England with orders to release his mother. And she came out of 16 years of confinement at the age of 66, and she did not retire. She took over. She rode across England receiving oaths in her son's name before he had even arrived. She ran the country while he was away on crusade. When he was captured and held for ransom in Germany, she raised the ransom herself, an enormous sum, squeezed out of a reluctant kingdom, and then she personally crossed Europe to collect him. She was over 70. In her late 70s, she crossed the Pyrenees in winter to fetch a granddaughter for a marriage that would keep the peace. She was still working, still negotiating, still riding, into her 80s. 16 years in a tower, and she came out and ran an empire. That is Eleanor of Aquitaine. And yet if you ask most people what they know about her, you will hear about a rumour concerning her uncle, from a fortnight in Antioch, when she was in her 20s, that no one has ever been able to prove. She lived 80 years and did more than almost any man of her century, and the gossip has outrun all of it. Let that queen in her tower, and the 16 years, and the 80-year-old crossing the mountains in the snow settle gently in the dark. We turn now to her granddaughter, who ruled France, and who was accused of exactly the same thing for exactly the same reason. Eleanor had a granddaughter, and her name was Blanche of Castile, and she ended up running France. Her husband died young and left her with a boy of 12 on the throne, and a kingdom full of barons who had no intention of taking orders from a Spanish widow. So Blanche did what her grandmother would have done. She took the child, and she had him crowned immediately, within weeks, before anybody could organize against it. And then she governed, and when the barons rebelled, which they did almost at once, she raised armies and beat them, repeatedly, and she went on governing for a decade, until her son was grown, and then she governed again when he went on crusade and left her in charge of the country. She was, by common consent, one of the most effective rulers France ever had. Her son became Louis IX, and then became Saint Louis, and he was the most admired king in Christendom, and she raised him and taught him and made his throne safe for him. And the barons said she was sleeping with the papal legate. His name was Cardinal Romano, and he was in France on church business and worked closely with the regent, because of course he did, because they were the two people trying to hold the kingdom together. And so the rumour went out that they were lovers, and it was repeated, and it was put into verses and songs, which was the medieval equivalent of a campaign, and the songs were sung in the streets and in the halls of her enemies. And there was an additional flourish that I find almost funny in its shamelessness. They said she was pregnant. That was the story, put about deliberately by the rebel barons, and it went around France, and it was extremely damaging, and it was completely fabricated. Blanche dealt with it in the most magnificent way available. She is said to have appeared before the court and the assembled nobility, and effectively invited them to look at her and see for themselves that there was no pregnancy and never had been. Whether she did precisely that, in precisely that way, is one of those details that has been polished over the centuries. But something like it happened, and the accusation collapsed, and she went on ruling, and the barons went back to losing battles to her. And notice, once more, that it is the same machine, and by now you can predict every part of it. Woman holds real power. Woman cannot be removed by any lawful means, because she is the king's mother and the regent, and entirely legitimate. Therefore, go for the body. Therefore, invent an affair, and if an affair is not enough, invent a pregnancy, because a pregnancy is a fact that can be asserted, and a fact that everyone will discuss. It failed this time because she was clever, and because she was visibly, provably not pregnant, and because she had armies. But they tried it. They always tried it. It was the first thing they reached for, every single time, for 1,000 years, and it did not matter whether the woman was a bearkeeper's daughter or a Castilian princess who raised a saint. Let that cardinal and those songs settle gently in the dark. We turn now to Paris, to the year 1314, and to the greatest royal scandal in the history of France. Now this one, unusually, appears to have been real, and it destroyed a dynasty. King Philip IV of France had 3 sons, and each of them had a wife. Louis was married to Marguerite of Burgundy. Philip was married to Jeanne. Charles was married to Blanche, who was Jeanne's sister. 3 princes, 3 princesses, and the succession of France running neatly through them. The king also had a daughter. Her name was Isabella, and she had been married off to the King of England, and she is going to matter enormously in a few chapters, so remember her. The story goes that Isabella came to visit her family in Paris, and that she gave gifts to her brothers and their wives, and that among the gifts were embroidered purses, and that later, at another gathering, she saw those same purses hanging from the belts of 2 Norman knights, brothers, named Gautier and Philippe Donnet. And Isabella went to her father. What followed was the most spectacular collapse of a royal family that medieval France ever saw. The king had the knights watched and then arrested. They were interrogated, which in 1314 meant what it meant, and they confessed. They said that they had been conducting affairs with Marguerite and Blanche, and that the meetings had taken place in an old tower on the bank of the Seine called the Tour de Nesle, and they said that Jeanne, the 3rd wife, had known about it and had kept the secret. The king moved with terrible speed. The 2 knights were tried and executed, and the manner of it was as public and as brutal as the age could manage, and I am not going to describe it, and you will not miss anything by not hearing it. Marguerite and Blanche were tried before the French Parliament, convicted, and had their heads shaved. They were sent to a fortress called Château Gaillard, up on its rock above the Seine, and put in a cell underground, and left there. Marguerite died within a year or so. She may have died of the cold and the conditions which were said to be appalling. She may not have. Her husband had become King of France by then and needed to remarry rather urgently, and an inconvenient wife in a cell had a way of resolving itself, and a good many people at the time drew the obvious conclusion. Blanche stayed in that cell for around 10 years and was eventually let out to enter a convent and died soon after. Jeanne, the third one, the one accused only of knowing, was defended by her husband, who fought for her, and she was eventually cleared and released, and became Queen of France beside him. Let that tower on the river settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what the scandal did afterwards, which was to break the oldest royal line in Europe and start the longest war. Here is why the Tour de Nesle matters, and it is nothing to do with the scandal itself. Philip IV had 3 sons. That is a comfortable position for a dynasty. 3 sons meant the line was secure for generations. The Capetians had ruled France in an unbroken male line for over 300 years, father to son, without a break, which was an extraordinary run of luck by medieval standards, and in 1314 they looked untouchable. And then within 14 years they were extinct. The scandal is the first crack. Louis becomes king, and his marriage is in ruins, and his daughter's legitimacy is now under a permanent shadow because her mother has been convicted of adultery. Can a girl whose mother was found guilty inherit the throne of France? Nobody knows. Nobody has had to ask before. So when Louis dies young, the question becomes urgent, and the answer the French nobility arrives at is essentially no, and they hand the crown to his brother instead. And then that brother dies, and the next brother becomes king, and then he dies too. 3 kings in 14 years, and not one surviving son between them. The line that had run father to son for 3 centuries simply stopped, so the crown went sideways to a cousin, and the House of Valois took the throne. And that was when somebody in England looked at a map and a family tree and noticed something. Because Isabella, the sister, the one who had spotted the purses, was the daughter of Philip IV, and her son was Edward III of England, and by any straightforward reading of inheritance, a grandson through a daughter has a better claim than a cousin through a side branch. The French said no, and produced a legal doctrine to explain why the crown could not pass through a woman, and Edward, eventually, said that he did not accept that, and that is the 100 Years' War. That is where it comes from. It ran, on and off, for 116 years, and it killed a colossal number of people, and it produced Agincourt and Joan of Arc, and the ruin of half of France. And you can trace the thread of it, if you like, back to 2 embroidered purses hanging from the wrong belts, and a sister who noticed, and a father who was told. The chroniclers, of course, loved the scandal and thought the constitutional crisis was a footnote. They always do. But look at what really happened. 3 young women were accused. 2 of them were destroyed, 1 of them died in a cell, and the 3rd spent a decade underground. And the men involved were executed. And out of that wreckage, the oldest monarchy in Europe fell apart and dragged 2 nations into a century of war. That is the largest consequence any scandal in this entire episode ever had, and it started with a purse. Let that broken dynasty settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the sister who noticed. Because she went home to England, and what happened to her there is the most extraordinary story of the night. Isabella of France was married to Edward II of England when she was 12 years old, and it was not a success. Edward was not interested in her. He was interested in Piers Gaveston, and after Gaveston was killed by the barons, he was interested in Hugh Despenser, and the nature of those relationships has been argued about for 700 years, and we are not going to settle it tonight, and it does not actually matter for our purposes. What matters is the effect. The king had favourites, and the favourites had the king's ear, and the king's gifts, and the king's lands, and the queen did not. And Despenser, in particular, was ruinous. He was grasping and vicious, and he ran the country into the ground, and he turned on Isabella directly. Her lands were taken, her income was cut, her children were removed from her care, her French servants were expelled. She was, by the mid-1320s, a Queen of England, with no money, no household, no children, and no husband, being systematically humiliated by her husband's favourite, while her husband watched and did nothing. And then, in 1325, they made a mistake. They sent her to France. There was a diplomatic dispute to settle with her brother, who was now King of France, and Isabella was the obvious envoy, and so they let her go. And she went to Paris, and she did the diplomacy, and then she simply did not come back. She sent word that she would not return, while Despenser stood between her and her husband. She put on mourning clothes and declared herself a widow, because, she said, someone had come between her and her marriage and destroyed it. It is one of the great pieces of political theatre of the Middle Ages, and it was extremely effective, and the French court ate it up. And in Paris she met Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was an English baron who had rebelled against Despenser, been captured, been imprisoned in the Tower of London, and then escaped, which almost nobody ever did. He had drugged his guards and got out through a hole in the wall and across the Thames and over the sea to France, and he was in Paris, and he was furious, and he was extremely capable. And here, for once, we are not dealing with a rumour. Isabella and Mortimer became lovers, openly, at the French court, in a way that scandalized everybody, including her own brother, who eventually asked her to leave. They did not deny it, they did not hide it. It was, by every account, real. And then the two of them raised an army. Let that queen in her mourning clothes settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what she did with that army, which no queen in English history had ever done before, or has ever done since. In September 1326, Isabella of France landed in Suffolk with a small force of mercenaries and rebels, and set out to take the kingdom from her husband. It should not have worked. She had perhaps 1,500 men. Edward was the anointed king, with the treasury and the machinery of state and the whole weight of legitimacy behind him. It took her about 6 weeks, because nobody would fight for him. That is the astonishing thing. The country had had enough. As Isabella moved west, town after town simply opened, and lord after lord came over, and the king's support did not so much collapse as evaporate, and Edward found himself running west into Wales with almost nobody left, and the treasury, and Despenser, and no army at all. They caught him in November. Despenser was executed in a manner I will not describe, and Isabella and Mortimer had the King of England in their hands, and had to decide what to do with a man you cannot legally remove because God has put him there. They invented something. In January 1327, they had Edward II deposed by Parliament, and they got him to abdicate in favour of his son, and they crowned the boy as Edward III, and Isabella ruled as regent with Mortimer beside her. An English king had been removed by his own wife, by force, and replaced with her son, and it had gone through Parliament, and it had stuck. That had never happened before in English history. It would set a precedent that would be used again and again, and it changed permanently what an English Parliament believed it was allowed to do. And in September, in a castle in Gloucestershire, Edward II died. The official story was natural causes. The unofficial stories began almost at once, and one of them is so grotesque and so famous that it has followed the case for 700 years, and I am not going to repeat it, partly because of the hour, and partly because most serious historians now think it was later propaganda. There is even a persistent theory that he did not die there at all and escaped abroad. Nobody knows. He went into that castle, and he did not come out, and his wife was running the country. For 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England. They were not especially good at it. They enriched themselves enormously, and Mortimer grew arrogant and grasping in exactly the way Despenser had. which is one of the sadder ironies of the whole story. And then, in 1330, the boy king turned 17 and decided he had had enough. He and a few companions came into Nottingham Castle at night through a secret passage and seized Mortimer in his chamber, and the story says that Isabella cried out through the door, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." He did not. Mortimer was executed, and Isabella was retired, quietly and comfortably, to a long and wealthy old age, and she lived nearly 30 more years, and she was buried in her wedding cloak. She had invaded England, deposed a king, and ruled the country, and her son let her live out her days in comfort. Whatever else Edward III thought about it, he never forgot she was his mother. Let that captured castle settle gently in the dark. We turn now to Naples, and to a queen accused of the murder of her own husband. Joanna I of Naples inherited a kingdom at 17, and spent the rest of her life being accused of things. Her husband was Andrew of Hungary, and it was a political marriage, and it was miserable, and there was a great deal of tension about whether he would be crowned as king in his own right, or remain merely the queen's husband. And in September 1345, at a monastery at Aversa, Andrew was called out of his bedroom in the night, and strangled and thrown from a window. The whole of Europe assumed Joanna had done it. Andrew's brother, the King of Hungary, certainly did, and he invaded to avenge him, and Joanna had to flee her own kingdom. And here is where it becomes remarkable. She went to Avignon, where the Pope was, and she stood trial before him, in person, a young queen, accused of the murder of her husband, standing in front of the papal court and answering for herself. She conducted her own defense, and she was acquitted. The Pope declared her innocent, and she got her kingdom back, and she ruled Naples for another 30 years. Now, the acquittal is complicated because she sold the Pope the city of Avignon at a very favourable price at around the same time, and cynics have been pointing that out for 650 years, and they may have a point. But it is also true that she stood up and spoke for herself, and was reportedly rather good at it, which is more than most accused queens ever got the chance to do. She ruled for 3 decades, and the accusations never stopped. She was married 4 times, and every husband that died produced a fresh rumour. She was called a murderess for the rest of her life, and the chroniclers wrote about her with the particular relish they saved for women who had outlived their accusers. And her end was grim. She backed the wrong side in a papal schism, and her own heir turned on her, and he took her, and she was smothered in a castle in 1382, on the orders of a man she had adopted as her son, and the Pope she had backed against declared her a heretic, and for a long time she was buried without ceremony. She is one of the very few women who ruled a kingdom in her own right for that long in that century. She held Naples for 30 years, in the middle of the wars and the plague and the schism, and she is remembered mostly as the woman who might have had her husband thrown out of a window. Let that queen and her trial settle gently in the dark. We turn now to France, and to a queen who was accused of the one thing that could disinherit a nation. Isabeau of Bavaria married Charles VI of France when she was about 15, and for 4 years it was a love match, and everybody said so, and then her husband lost his mind. That is the fact underneath everything else in her life, and it is worth stating plainly and gently. In 1392, Charles was riding through a forest and suffered some kind of episode, and he was never reliably well again. For the remaining 30 years of his reign he moved in and out of it. There were long stretches when he was entirely himself, and long stretches when he was not, when he did not know who he was, and did not recognize his own wife, and was frightened of her, and at times refused to let her near him. Now imagine being Isabeau. Your husband is the King of France. He is sometimes the man you married, and sometimes a stranger who does not know your name. and the kingdom does not stop needing to be governed while he is unwell. So somebody must govern it, and the two obvious candidates are his brother, Louis of Orléans, and his cousin, John of Burgundy, and those two men hate each other with a completeness that will eventually tear France in half. And you, the Queen, are in the middle, trying to hold a regency together for a husband who cannot help you and children who need protecting. So she did what she could, and she leaned at times on Louis of Orléans, because he was the king's own brother and the natural ally. And the Burgundians said she was sleeping with him. Of course they did. It is the same weapon. It is always the same weapon. And it worked so well that they escalated it and made the most devastating accusation available in the medieval world. They said the Dauphin was not the king's son. Think about what that does. If the heir to France is illegitimate, then the whole succession is void, and whoever is making the accusation gets to propose an alternative. It is not gossip. It is a constitutional weapon, aimed at the throne, and it is fired through the Queen's body, because that is the only place it can be fired from. And it stuck to her for 600 years. Isabeau of Bavaria came down through history as a byword for a wanton and treacherous queen, greedy and unfaithful, who sold out her own son and her own country. That was still the standard account well into the 20th century. And then historians actually went and looked at the sources and found something rather shocking, which is that a great deal of it was manufactured much later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, out of Burgundian propaganda that had been taken at face value. The dirtiest specific stories about her turn out to be far more recent than the Middle Ages. Modern scholarship has been quietly rehabilitating her for decades now, and the picture that emerges is much less exciting and much more human, which is a woman doing an impossible job in an impossible situation, with an ill husband and two lethal factions, and a country coming apart, and mostly trying to keep her children alive. But the treaty is real. In 1420 she was party to the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited her own son and gave the crown of France to the King of England. That is the thing she has never been forgiven for. Whether she was a traitor selling her son, or a woman with no power at all being made to put her name on a document by the faction holding the pen, is a question people still argue about. It is much easier to say she was wicked. It requires nothing. Let that mad king and his cornered queen settle gently in the dark. We turn now across the channel, where the very same accusation is about to be aimed at another queen, for exactly the same reason. They did it again, 60 years later, to Margaret of Anjou, and this time it started a civil war. Margaret was married to Henry VI of England, and Henry, in one of history's less charitable coincidences, was the grandson of Charles VI of France, and he inherited the illness. In 1453 he collapsed into a catatonic state so complete that he could not speak or move or respond for over a year, and in that same year Margaret gave birth to a son. You do not need me to tell you what happened next. The Duke of York, who had been the heir presumptive until that baby arrived, and who now was not, discovered that he had grave doubts about the child's paternity, and so did his supporters, and the rumour went out, and it named a couple of candidates, and it did the work it was designed to do. It could not have been true, incidentally, in the version that mattered. The king was perfectly well at the point the child was conceived. The illness came later, but that never has anything to do with anything, and the rumour ran anyway, and the effect of it was the Wars of the Roses. Not by itself, of course. There were other causes, and deep ones, but the question of whether Prince Edward was the king's true son was one of the hinges the whole conflict turned on, because it was the difference between a Lancastrian heir and a Yorkist one, and men were prepared to kill about it for 30 years. And Margaret, faced with a husband who was insensible and a duke who was calling her son a bastard, did the only thing available to her. She fought, she raised armies, she commanded them, in the field, in England, in the 15th century, which was not a thing queens did. She fought for her son's inheritance for nearly 20 years with a ferocity that terrified everyone, and the Yorkists called her the she-wolf of France, borrowing the insult that had been used for Isabella before her, because there were only ever about 3 insults, and they simply passed them down, and she lost. At Tewkesbury in 1471, her son was killed, 17 years old, and her cause died with him, and her husband died in the Tower within days, under circumstances nobody has ever satisfactorily explained. She was ransomed home to France and died there in poverty about 10 years later. She had defended her son's right to be king from the day he was born, and they had spent his entire life saying he was not his father's, and in the end he died at 17 on a battlefield in Gloucestershire, and it did not matter what the truth had been. Let that queen and her lost son settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a variation on the weapon, because when adultery would not do the job, there was always something worse to accuse a woman of. There was a second charge, and it was kept for special occasions, and it was worse than adultery, because there was no defence against it whatsoever. Witchcraft. In 1441, Eleanor Cobham was the Duchess of Gloucester, and her husband Humphrey was the heir presumptive to the throne of England, which meant that if the young King Henry VI died without children, Eleanor would be queen. That made her a problem for a great many powerful men, and it made her husband a problem, and Humphrey was popular and difficult to attack directly. So they went through her. The charge was that she had employed astrologers to cast the king's horoscope and predict his death, which was a treasonable act, because predicting a king's death shaded very easily into wishing for it, and from there into arranging it. And it emerged, or was made to emerge, that she had also obtained potions from a woman called Marguerite Jourdemain, who was known as the Witch of Eye, and the story was that these were love potions used to catch Humphrey in the first place, and the implication was that everything about her, her marriage, her position, her whole rise, had been achieved by sorcery. She admitted some of it. She said she had obtained potions, but only to help her conceive a child, which is a defence so ordinary and so human that it is almost painful to read. It did not help. She was made to do public penance. She walked through the streets of London bareheaded, on 3 separate days carrying a lighted taper, in front of the entire city, and then she was imprisoned for the rest of her life. She died in a castle in Wales after 11 years of it. Her marriage was dissolved. Her husband's career never recovered, and he was dead within a few years, arrested and gone. Marguerite Jourdemain was burned. And look at what the accusation of witchcraft does that the accusation of adultery cannot. Adultery requires a lover, and a lover is a man, and a man can be produced or not produced, and there is at least in principle something to argue about. Witchcraft requires nothing. It is invisible by definition. The proof of it is that it worked. Why is this woman powerful? Sorcery. Why did a great man marry her? Potions. Why has she risen so far above her station? What other explanation could there possibly be? It is the perfect accusation, because it explains a woman's success by definition and cannot be answered. And they used it. They used it on Bertrada, who was a witch because a king gave up his sacraments for her. They would use it on Anne Boleyn in the next century. It sat in the box beside the other weapon, and when the other weapon was not enough, they took it out. Let that lighted taper and that long walk settle gently in the dark. We turn now past the end of the Middle Ages, briefly, because the machine did not stop when the Middle Ages did. I want to step just outside our period for a moment, because the story does not end where the textbooks put the line, and because the most famous case of all is sitting just on the other side of it. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed. She was Queen of England, and the charges against her were adultery with 5 men, one of whom was her own brother, and conspiracy to kill the king. And she was convicted and beheaded less than 3 weeks after the first arrest. Now, Virtually no serious historian believes the charges. The dates in the indictment are demonstrably wrong. Several of the alleged encounters are placed on days when she was provably somewhere else or had just given birth. The men were tortured or threatened, and 4 of the 5 denied everything to the end, and the only confession came from a musician who had every reason to say whatever he was told to say. The whole case was assembled in a fortnight by a man who needed it to work, and it shows. But look at the shape of it. Look at what they reached for. Here is a king who wants a new wife, and a queen who has not produced a son, and a political faction that wants her gone. And they could have accused her of anything. They could have argued the marriage was invalid, and in fact they did that too, separately, and it would have been sufficient. But it was not enough. What they wanted was her destruction, and so they reached, exactly as Procopius had reached 1,000 years earlier, exactly as the Burgundians had reached, exactly as the barons had reached at Blanche, for her body. Adultery, multiple lovers, incest with her own brother, which is precisely the flourish thrown at Eleanor of Aquitaine 4 centuries before, and, at the fringes, whispers of witchcraft, because of course there were, 1,000 years apart, the same 3 ingredients. The woman has power. There is no lawful way to remove her. Therefore, the marriage, therefore her fidelity, therefore her body. And it ended with an actual sword, on an actual scaffold, in the Tower of London, on a woman who was about 35 years old and had a 3-year-old daughter. And that daughter, incidentally, grew up to be Elizabeth I and ruled England for 45 years and never married anybody at all, and one is entitled to wonder whether the 2 facts are related. Let that scaffold settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the last and cleverest version of the weapon, which was to stop inventing rumours and start manufacturing evidence. The final refinement came 30 years later, and it was the most sophisticated version of the machine ever built, and it worked perfectly. Mary, Queen of Scots, had a husband called Darnley, and in February 1567, the house he was staying in was blown up, and Darnley was found dead in the garden. And within 3 months, Mary had married the Earl of Bothwell, who everybody believed had done it. That was quite bad enough on its own, but it was not sufficient to destroy her legally, and her enemies needed her destroyed legally, because she was an anointed queen, and you cannot simply remove one of those on a rumour. So they produced a casket. It was a silver box, and they said it had belonged to Bothwell, and they said it contained letters and sonnets written by Mary to Bothwell, in her own hand, and they said the letters proved that she had been his lover before the murder, and had known about the plot and had helped arrange it, and that was the end of her. The letters were shown to a commission in England, and they were never proved genuine, and Mary was never allowed to see them or to answer them in person, which she demanded repeatedly and was repeatedly refused, and on the strength of documents she was not permitted to examine, produced by the men who had taken her throne, she was held prisoner in England for 19 years and eventually executed. And here is the thing. The casket letters have vanished, all of them. The originals disappeared in the 16th century, and no one has seen them since. And every scholar who has ever wanted to test them has had to work from copies of translations of copies. Historians have argued about them for 400 years, and the argument cannot be settled, because the evidence itself is gone. They may have been genuine. They may have been forged outright. The most persuasive theory to many people is the cleverest possibility of all, which is that they were partly genuine, real letters written by Mary to somebody else at some other time, with a few passages inserted, so that the handwriting would survive any test, because most of it really was her handwriting. Do you see the elegance of that? It is the whole 1,000-year-old machine, perfected. You no longer need to invent an accusation and hope it sticks. You manufacture the proof, in her own hand, and then you make sure she never gets to look at it. That is where this story ends, and it ends outside our period, in a silver box that no longer exists. Let that vanished casket settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the pattern, because you will have seen it by now, and it is time we looked at it directly. You will have seen it by now. It is the same story. It is always the same story, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And I am sorry, because it will slightly spoil every historical drama you ever watch again. The recipe is fixed. It has 3 ingredients and it never varies. First, the woman must have power. Not decorative power. Real power. She must be making decisions that men wanted to make. Theodora sat in council. Fredegund ran a faction. Brunhilde governed a kingdom for 40 years. Judith had the emperor's ear. Eleanor held Aquitaine. Isabella took a country. Isabeau held a regency. Margaret commanded armies. Every single woman we have talked about tonight was standing on ground that somebody else wanted. Second, there must be no legitimate way to remove her. This is the crucial one. A male rival can be beaten in battle, or outmaneuvered in council, or accused of treason, and there are procedures for all of it. But a queen is not a rival you can challenge. She is the king's wife, and her position comes from her marriage and her blood, and there is no lawful mechanism for a nobleman to simply take her out. She sits behind the throne, protected, and she cannot be got at by any of the normal means. So, third, you go for the marriage, because that is the one seam in the armor. The whole edifice rests on the marriage, and the marriage rests on her fidelity, and her fidelity cannot be proved. That is the beauty of it, from the point of view of the accuser. She cannot demonstrate a negative. She cannot produce a witness to something that did not happen. There is no defense, and there was never meant to be one. The accusation is not designed to be tested. It is designed to be unanswerable. And the payload, the thing the whole weapon is built to deliver, is doubt about the children. That is what it is all for. Judith's son, Isabeau's dauphin, Margaret's prince, Marguerite's daughter, whose claim died with her mother's conviction. If the queen is unfaithful, then the heir might not be the king's, and if the heir might not be the king's, then the succession is open, and if the succession is open, then the men making the accusation have a path to the throne. That is the machine. It is not about sex at all. It never was. It is about inheritance, and the accusation of unchastity is simply the most efficient tool ever devised for interfering with an inheritance. Because it is cheap, it requires no evidence, it cannot be disproved, and it does the damage even when nobody believes it. The doubt alone is sufficient. The doubt is the product. And it worked. That is the sad part. It worked every single time for 1,000 years on the most powerful women in Europe, and the chroniclers wrote it all down, and we are still repeating it tonight, in the dark, 1,500 years later, which means, I suppose, that it is still working. Let that old machine settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the men who operated it, and to the strange fact that most of them were monks. Here is a thing that is easy to miss, and it changes how you read everything. Nearly every word we have tonight was written by a celibate man. Think about that for a moment. The great chroniclers of the Middle Ages, the men who wrote down these stories of queens and their lovers and their appetites and their tangled bedrooms, were overwhelmingly monks, men who lived in monasteries, men who had taken vows and, in most cases, kept them, men whose entire world was male, who had no wives, who in many cases had barely spoken to a woman since childhood. And they are our source for everything. Almost every detail of the private lives of medieval queens that we possess was recorded by a man who had, quite deliberately, arranged his own life to have as little to do with women as it was possible to have. So you have to ask what they were doing, and you get a range of answers, and none of them are simple. Some of it is politics, plainly. A monastery had patrons, and the patrons had enemies, and the chronicle reflected it. Gregory of Tours was a bishop with a stake in the Frankish wars. The monks who wrote about Isabeau were often writing for Burgundy. They knew exactly whose side they were on. Some of it is theology. If your reading of scripture tells you that woman is the doorway through which sin entered the world, then a wicked queen is not merely gossip, she is evidence. She confirms the model. Every story about a treacherous, appetitive, destructive queen is a small proof that the world works the way you have been taught it does, and there is a deep satisfaction in that, and it makes you an easy audience for such a story and an eager teller of it. And some of it, I think, is much simpler and much more human than either. They were men, shut up in a room with a pen, for a life. And out beyond the wall there were courts and kings, and beautiful, dangerous women, and enormous appetites, and everything they had renounced. And they had to write about it. That was the job. Somebody had to record the reign, and it was them. I do not think you can read the secret history, with its extraordinary energy, its fixation, its inability to leave the subject alone, without noticing that Procopius is enjoying himself, and that the enjoyment is doing something to him. He goes back to it and back to it. He piles it higher. He is not a man reluctantly recording an unpleasant truth. He is a man who has found a place to put something, and that is who wrote our sources. Men who could not have the world, describing in loving detail the wickedness of the people who did. It is not a reason to disbelieve all of it, but it is a reason to hold it lightly, the way you would hold any account of a party written by somebody standing outside in the rain looking through the window. Let those monks and their pens settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the strangest sentence in the whole medieval world, which was reserved almost entirely for women, and which was in many ways worse than execution. When a medieval king wanted rid of a woman, he did not usually kill her. He put her in a convent. It happened over and over. Judith was sent to one, Zoe was nearly sent to one, and the city rioted about it. It was the standard remedy, and it is worth understanding, because it looks merciful from the outside and it was not. Understand what it actually did. A woman placed in a convent was legally and socially finished. She could not remarry, so she could not produce a rival heir, and she could not carry her lands to another man. She could not act politically, because she was enclosed. She could not gather a faction, because nobody could reach her. She was removed from the board entirely, permanently, without anybody having to do anything as vulgar as killing a queen, and everyone could congratulate themselves on their restraint. And it was reversible, which is the cleverest part and the cruelest. If she was needed later, she could be brought out. A woman in a convent was not destroyed, she was stored. For some women, and I want to be fair, this was genuinely a good outcome, and some went willingly. Bertrada chose it at the end of her life, after Philip died, and appears to have been perfectly content. A convent could be a place of real learning, real authority, and real peace. And an abbess could be a genuinely powerful woman running a large institution with her own lands and her own income. Some of the most educated women of the Middle Ages were nuns, and some of them were there by choice and glad of it. But that is not what it was for, when a king used it. When it was done to a woman, it was a burial. It was a way of making somebody stop existing without incurring the cost of a murder, and the medieval world used it constantly, on inconvenient wives, on rival claimants, on daughters who would not marry the right man, on any woman whose continued presence in the world was a problem to somebody who had the power to solve it. Nobody ever put a king in a convent. There was no equivalent. A troublesome king had to be fought, or deposed, or killed, at enormous risk and cost. A troublesome queen could simply be walked into a building and left there. It is one of the plainest asymmetries in the whole medieval arrangement, and once you notice it everywhere. Let that quiet building with its closed door settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the queens who got away with it, because there were some, and they are worth celebrating before we sleep. I do not want to leave you with a parade of ruined women, because that is not actually the whole picture, and it would be a poor way to send you off to sleep. So let us count the victories, because there were more than you would think, Theodora died an empress, in the palace, adored by her husband, who was so undone by her death that the court noticed he was never the same again. Whatever Procopius scratched into his secret book, she won every fight she was ever in, and the man who hated her had to bow to her every day of her life, and could only take his revenge on paper, in the dark, after she was safely dead. Fredegund died in her bed, old, undefeated, with her son on the throne. Whatever else you think of her, the servant girl beat the entire Frankish aristocracy, and they never laid a hand on her. Judith fought a slander campaign twice, publicly, and beat it both times, and her son got his kingdom, and that kingdom became France. Zoe spent 50 years locked in the women's quarters, and then 20 years doing exactly as she liked, and a whole city rose in rebellion to keep her on the throne. Eleanor came out of 16 years in a tower at 66, and ran an empire for another 15 years, and crossed the Pyrenees in winter in her late 70s, and died at about 80, having outlived nearly every man who ever tried to control her, including 2 kings. Jeanne of Burgundy, accused in the Tour de Nesle affair, had a husband who fought for her instead of abandoning her, and was cleared, and became Queen of France. Isabella invaded England with 1,500 men, deposed the king, ruled the country, and then lived nearly 30 more years in wealth and comfort with her son's protection, and was buried in her wedding cloak, which is either the most romantic or the most chilling detail in this entire episode, and I have never been able to decide which. Joanna of Naples stood up in front of the Pope, defended herself against a charge of murdering her husband, was acquitted, got her kingdom back, and ruled it for 30 years. And Isabeau, 600 years after her death, is being quietly rehabilitated by historians who went back to the documents and found that the worst of it had been invented long after she was gone. She is winning, slowly, in the 21st century, which is a strange sort of victory, but it counts. That is not a bad record, all told. The machine was real, and it was cruel, and it worked far too often. But it did not always work, and a surprising number of these women looked at the whole apparatus of the medieval world, the chroniclers and the councils and the convents and the law, and simply went straight through it. Let those victories settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the question of what any of it was really like, which is the one thing all our chroniclers cannot tell us. Here is what we do not have, and it is worth a moment before we drift, because it is the true shape of this whole subject. We do not have a single word from any of them, not one. Theodora left nothing. Fredegund left nothing. Brunhilde ruled for 40 years and corresponded with popes, and we have some of her letters, which makes her one of the luckiest. And even then what survives is official, formal, the queen speaking as the state. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most famous woman of the Middle Ages, left us essentially nothing personal. Isabella wrote letters, and they survive in the archives, and they are about business. Nobody wrote a diary. Nobody wrote a memoir. Nobody sat down and said, "This is what it was actually like to be me." And so the entire private life of every woman we have spoken about tonight comes to us through the eyes of men who mostly did not like them. We do not know what Theodora thought about the hippodrome. We do not know whether Eleanor loved Henry or hated him, or both, or neither. We do not know what Isabella felt riding through England at the head of an army toward her husband. We do not know whether Isabeau lay awake in the dark next to a man who did not know who she was and what she thought about while she was doing it. All of that is simply gone. It went with them. And what we have instead is the noise, the rumour, the accusation, the chronicle, the smear, the loudest voices in the room, which were always the voices of the people who wanted something. And so when someone tells you what a medieval queen was like, what they are really telling you is what her enemies said. And that is not nothing. It is real historical evidence. It tells you a great deal, though mostly it tells you about the accusers. But it is not her. She is not in there. She is the one part of the story that never got written down, and she is the only part that was ever actually true. Let that great silence settle gently in the dark. We turn now, softly, toward sleep, and toward the women themselves, one last time. Here is a practical thought that I find quietly devastating to the entire genre, and I offer it gently, because it is late, and I am not trying to spoil anybody's fun. A medieval queen was essentially never by herself. We think of privacy as ordinary. You shut a door and you are alone. That did not exist for these women in any form we would recognize. A queen lived at the center of a household that was designed, quite deliberately, to surround her at all times. She had ladies in waiting, and the ladies had servants, and there were chamberlains and clerks and confessors and messengers, and they were always there. She dressed with help, she ate with company, she travelled with a retinue of dozens, she prayed with her household around her, and she slept with people in the room. This is the part that modern readers stumble over. A great lady's bedchamber was not a private space. Ladies slept in the chamber with her, on pallets, or in the antechamber, directly outside, within earshot, all night, every night. That was not an intrusion. That was the arrangement. It was a mark of status, and it was security, and it was simply how it was done. So consider the logistics of the affairs we have been discussing all night. Consider what a queen would actually have to do. She would have to get out of a bed with women sleeping around it, cross a chamber, get past whoever was sleeping in the doorway, pass through a household of dozens of people whose entire job was to know where she was, all of it in a building lit by candles and full of servants who slept lightly and gossiped professionally, and get to a tower and get back before dawn without one single person noticing or mentioning it ever, and then do it repeatedly and have absolutely no one talk. I am not saying it was impossible. People are ingenious, and the Tour de Nesle affair seems genuinely to have happened, and the fact that it was uncovered at all rather proves the point about how hard it was to hide. But the sheer casual frequency of the accusations, the way chroniclers describe queens conducting long careers of secret liaison, sits very badly against the physical reality of how these women actually lived, which is that they were watched constantly by a large staff from waking to sleeping for their entire lives. The medieval queen had less privacy than almost any person alive today. She was the most surveilled human being in her kingdom, and the chroniclers, who knew this perfectly well, because many of them had lived at court and seen it, wrote as though she could slip out whenever she pleased, which tells you, I think, that they were not really thinking about it very hard. They were not constructing a plausible account. They were reaching for the accusation because it was the accusation that was available, and the practicalities never crossed their minds, because the practicalities were never the point. Let that crowded chamber settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what a day actually looked like for one of these women, which is far quieter than anything we have discussed so far. Let us do something calming and follow a queen through an ordinary day, because 99 days in 100 contained no scandal whatsoever, and the ordinary is where these women actually lived. She wakes early. Everyone does. There is no reason to lie in when the light is the only light you have, and the day's business is enormous. Her ladies are already moving. There is water, and there is dressing, and dressing is a serious operation, because the clothes are complicated and heavy, and there are layers and pins and laces, and none of it can be done alone. It takes a while, and it is done in company, and there is talk, and this is where a great deal of the actual politics of a court happened, in the chamber, in the morning, among women, in a way no monk ever recorded, because no monk was ever in the room. Then chapel, mass, every morning, without fail. This was not a formality. These were people who believed, and the day began with God, and the queen's piety was watched and reported and mattered enormously to her reputation. Then the business. And there was a great deal of business, and this is the part that gets left out of the dramas. A queen ran a household that might number in the hundreds, with its own accounts and its own staff and its own supply chain. There were letters, there were petitions, because people wrote to the queen constantly, asking for favours, positions, mercy, money, intercession with the king. There were her own lands to manage, and rents to collect, and disputes to settle. She had an income and it had to be administered. This was a full working life, and the paperwork of it is one of the few places where these women's actual voices survive, and it is all about wool and wages and land. Then dinner, which is the main meal and happens in the middle of the day, and is public, and is theatre. People watch the queen eat. That is part of the job. Then the afternoon, which might be hunting or hawking if there was time and weather, and there often was, because these were outdoor people, and the hunt was the great recreation of the age, and queens rode as hard as anybody. Then the evening, and the household gathering, and music, and perhaps somebody reading aloud, and the talk going on into the dark, and the candles burning down. And then bed, in the chamber, with her ladies around her, and the whole thing again tomorrow. That is the life. Thousands of days of it, year after year. Administration and prayer and letters and rents and hunting and dinner. It is not what the chroniclers wrote about, because there is nothing to write about. And it is what almost the entire life of almost every queen we have discussed tonight was actually made of. Let that ordinary day, and the thousands like it, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the way these stories escaped from the chronicles and went out into the world, where they got very much larger. The chroniclers wrote it down, but that is not why you have heard of these women. The chronicles sat in monasteries and were read by almost nobody. What made these stories immortal was what happened next, which is that other people got hold of them and improved them. Take the Tour de Nez. The actual affair was a scandal in 1314, and it would have faded, the way scandals do, into a paragraph in a history of the Capetians. And then, 500 years later, in the 19th century, Alexandre Dumas got hold of it and wrote a play, and the play was a sensation, and in it, Marguerite is not merely an adulterous princess. She is a monster who takes lovers up to the tower and has them murdered afterwards and thrown into the Seine in sacks so that they cannot talk. None of that is in the record. Dumas made it up, or borrowed it from a legend that had grown up over centuries in exactly the way these things do. But it is a wonderful bit of theatre, and it played to packed houses, and it is now, for a great many people, simply what happened at the Tour de Nez. The play has outrun the history by a distance that cannot be closed. Or take Isabella. She is the she-wolf of France because a poet in the 18th century called her that, in a poem about a different subject entirely, and the phrase was so good that it stuck to her forever, and then Shakespeare's contemporaries and successors did the rest. Or take Margaret of Anjou, who is a character in Shakespeare, and who appears across 4 of his plays, more than almost anyone, snarling and prophesying and cursing. That is a magnificent piece of writing, and it is not a portrait of a woman. It is a portrait of a Tudor idea of a woman, written by a man working for a dynasty that had a very direct interest in the Lancastrians looking bad. And this is how it works. The chronicler writes it down with a grudge. The next chronicler copies it and adds a detail. A century later, somebody writes a moral history and hardens the rumour into a fact. A dramatist finds it and makes it magnificent. A romantic novelist finds the drama and makes it lurid. A film finds the novel. And by the time it reaches you, in a warm bed, in the 21st century, it has been through 15 sets of hands, each of which improved it, and there is nothing left of the woman at the bottom of it at all. That is not a tragedy exactly. It is just what stories do. They are not archives. They are organisms, and they evolve, and the ones that survive are not the true ones, they are the good ones. But it does mean that when you find yourself certain about a medieval queen, it is always worth asking who told you and who told them, and how many people have enjoyed the story since. Let those growing stories settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the small things these women actually left behind, which are almost the only true things we have. Here is what survives. Not the rumours, the real things. There is a tomb at Fontevraud Abbey in France, and on it there is a carved effigy of Eleanor of Aquitaine. She is lying on her back with her head on a cushion, and she is dressed, and her hands are raised, and she is holding an open book. She is reading. Her husband Henry lies beside her, hands empty. Her son Richard lies nearby, hands empty, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most gossiped about woman of the Middle Ages, chose, or somebody who knew her chose, to have herself carved for eternity in the middle of a book. It is the only royal effigy of its kind from that period. 800 years, and she is still reading. Whoever made that decision was telling us something, and what they were telling us has nothing whatever to do with Antioch. There are Brunhilde's roads. In parts of France there are old Roman roads that local memory attached to her name, and centuries after her death people were still calling them the Brunhilde roads because they remembered she had rebuilt them. She held a kingdom for 40 years, and what ordinary people remembered was that she fixed the roads. There is Hagia Sophia, which stands because Theodora would not run. There are the letters, in the archives, in the Queen's own administrative hands, about grain and rents and wages and the price of cloth. Dull, careful, and real, and worth more than every scandal in every chronicle put together. There is Isabella's wedding cloak, which she kept for 50 years, through the loveless marriage and the humiliation and the invasion and the deposition and the death of her husband and the ruling of England and the fall of Mortimer and the long quiet retirement, and which she was buried in, whatever that means, and nobody will ever know what it meant. But she kept it, all that time, and she took it with her, and that is a fact, and it is hers, and no chronicler put it there. That is what is left, a carved book, some roads, a church, a cloak, a pile of receipts. It is not much against 1,000 years of rumour, but it is true, and the rumour is not, and on the whole I would rather have the book. Let those small true things settle gently in the dark. We turn now, at last, only towards sleep. The candles are burning down now, in all those chambers, across all those centuries. In Constantinople, the Empress is asleep in a palace that smells of perfume, and the man who hates her is awake in a room somewhere else, writing. In Gaul, 2 queens are lying awake in 2 different halls thinking about each other. In Winchester, an old woman is asleep on the eve of a story that will be told about her 400 years later and will not be true. In a tower in England, a queen who has been imprisoned for 16 years is asleep and does not know that she has 15 years of empire left in her. In Chateau Gaillard, in a cell under the rock, a young woman is very cold. In a castle in Nottingham, a boy is planning to come up through the passage. In a chamber in Paris, a queen is sitting beside a husband who does not know her name. All of them are gone now, every one. The clever ones and the ruthless ones and the innocent ones and the guilty ones, the ones who won and the ones who lost, the accusers and the accused. It all happened, and it mattered enormously to all of them, and then it stopped mattering, and now it is only stories, told in the dark, to help a stranger sleep. And there is something enormously restful in that, if you let it be. Not sad, restful. Every single one of those women lay down at the end of a day, exactly as you are lying down now. They had a body that was tired. They had a mind that would not stop. They had the day's arguments still going round, the thing somebody said, the thing they should have said, the worry about tomorrow. And they put it down, and they slept, because everybody does. and the whole vast machinery of the medieval world could not stop them being simply a tired person at the end of the day who wanted to sleep. That is the thing we actually share with them, not the crowns and not the scandals. The lying down, the letting go, the ordinary and universal business of a human being at the end of a day, closing their eyes in the dark and trusting the world to still be there in the morning. You are doing it now. They did it then. It is the oldest thing we do. Let all of it, the whole gaudy, scandalous parade of it, settle gently in the dark. We turn now, only, toward rest. There is nothing more to hear tonight, nothing to hold, nothing to judge, nothing to decide. The queens are all asleep. The chroniclers have put down their pens. The candles are out. Let your body grow heavier now. Let it sink down into the warmth, into the softness beneath you, letting the bed take all of it. Your feet and your legs growing heavy. Your hands and your arms resting soft and still. Your shoulders sinking. Your jaw loose. Your breath moving slow and low and easy, all on its own. Let the last of the images fade now, gently. The burning city, and the woman who would not run. The old road that still carries her name. The tower on the river. The queen riding through a country that will not fight for her husband. The carved book in the hands of a woman who has been reading it for 800 years. Let them all go soft and dim and drift away. The way the day is drifting away. The way everything drifts away in the end. Quietly and without complaint. There is nothing to guard tonight. There is nothing to carry. There is nowhere to be and nothing to do, and nobody who needs anything from you until morning. You are safe. You are warm. You are held. Good night, traveller. Rest easy. Sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.